There's a bridge where I grew up. A man lives under it. There's a bridge where I grew up. It's nothing to write home about. Just a stout little thing that's been around as long as I can remember, resting on a mean little creek in a lonely little valley. My grandma remembers it as a kid, if that puts its age to scale. The population utilizing it, although still minuscule, grew up because of it. But it's still easier to access the town via ferry rather than the bridge. Whoever built it had the wherewithal to make it wide enough for a modern car to drive across. But I'd be hard-pressed to trust anything with substantial weight to drive over it. You gotta line your tires up just right to traverse it comfortably. You won't fall through, but the lengthwise boards are just tire-spaced, and the widthwise boards will rattle your teeth. In the summer heat, it stinks of creosote. Thing is, it's eerie. Never had a specific reason to say why that's so, but I got goosebumps every time I crossed it as a kid, and I still do as an adult. Back then, I walked atop the bridge feeling somewhat restless, but eager to see the local salmon run below me. I was only ever excited to see that bridge when the fish came in. There were so many red, gorgeous fish, stoically marching their way to their ends for the next generation, that my fear was always temporarily quelled. One summer, I watched the salmon approach from downriver, lining up in thick groups, and advance until their crowded crimson bodies were swallowed into the shadows of the old bridge. I jumped across the bridge's girth to see them continue onward on the other side, but there was not a single fish there. I ran back and watched more fish swim in, but still no fish swam out when I repeated the loop. There were too many fish to be hiding in the shade of the bridge. So I slid down the embankment into the steep river belly and stood tangled with the willows, trying to get under the bridge or at least peer into it. The willows felt tight and resisted my advance, and when one branch whipped me across my face, I was done with that investigation. I stifled tears and clambered back on top of the bridge, thinking of how oppressive it felt to be in the belly of those plants. I looked again at the fish below. Many swam in, but still none swam out. I moved away years ago, having outgrown my rural roots. I live in a city now, and a big one at that. We've got plenty of bridges, but none like the tar-soaked makeshift crossing I grew up with. And none of them make me afraid, at least until recently. My mates and I had gone out to a show. A few drinks in, I opted to walk home, cause it really wasn't that far. And I crossed the bridge at Creek Street to my house when that distant eeriness overtook me. I carefully walked to the edge of the bridge and stared at the water. At first, there was nothing, just the fake warmth of nearby park lamps and the sterility of a city park. But abruptly, a large school of fish rushed from under the bridge and into the water beyond. That wouldn't be so weird. Fish hide under bridges all the time. Except, these were salmon, and there's not salmon on this side of the country, at least not red salmon. I guess it's possible that they were introduced or escaped, but they felt familiar, for lack of a better way to put it. I jumped down from the bridge and scuttled down the embankment like I had done so many years ago. Slivers of red fish surfaced beside me, distrusting of my presence. It'd been at least 20 years if these were, impossibly, the same fish. Their natural lifespan is no more than 5. I stared beyond the bridge downstream where they came from. It was just the same park as it had been on the other side, but my throat dried and my skin grew clammy. I plucked a stick from the bank and tossed it into the darkness of the bridge. The blackness swallowed my vantage, and nothing strange responded, save for a salmon's thrashing tail. The fish continued. I'm not sure what became of them, but they swam onward into the dark waters of the park, alongside restless lanes of traffic. The incident with the New York sockeye left me sifting through forgotten memories. There were a lot of peculiarities about the bridge that I had forgotten or simply didn't piece as obscurely relevant until pressed. We'd splash around the creek as kids, and the bridge was readily accessible, so it was a common spot. We had a bit of a swimming hole just below it on the warmest days, and we'd often find relics. For a creek that flowed from pristine wilderness, we never questioned what washed up nor how anything floated where it rested. I remember finding a square bucket with some sort of language I didn't recognize on one outing. Mandarin, maybe. I only remember that in our innocent ignorance, we pulled taut the corners of our eyes and chanted learned slurs in response. But I had to cease the hunt through fond history when I was abruptly told that my father's last hospital visit resulted in his discharge to hospice at home. Dad had sat on a cancer diagnosis for years, but up until this last event, he staved off the disease. It had been stable. It wasn't spreading. But now the MRI showed its encroached to his lungs, stomach, liver. He was Swiss cheese with metastatic tumors. Mom had died years earlier, and I guess his body and mind decided he was ready to join her. I quickly returned home, knowing the time I had left with him was short. When I arrived, another one of those forgotten personal details entered my attention by literally stumbling in front of me. Ivan, the town drunk. Ivan disappeared for the longest time and returned with an ornate and absurd dagger when I was about 12 or 13. Dad beat the shit out of him when he shook the blade at me a little too closely, screaming, "There's a man that lives under the bridge," spittle launching from his dehydrated tongue. I stole this knife from him. The dagger looked almost like a movie prop from Aladdin, curved blade and all, and the hilt sparkled more sinisterly than the sharpened edge. No less, the unfamiliarity in its design scared the hell out of me. Ivan was batshit, a certified nut job. We swapped stories about his misdeeds, and his peculiar weapon only enhanced that terror. So when he shoved me in recent times in an effort to defy gravity, I was terrified through muscle memory despite worse encounters in the city I now resided. "Harasho," he spoke in a pickled accent, a word of habit. I flinched and was ready to argue that it wasn't fine, but I saw his eyes glint with a mixture of shock and sudden consciousness. "My boy," he stammered, and I was furious. I wasn't his boy. Perhaps it was the bitter contrast knowing that the only man that had to right to address me with that title was dying, but I was seething regardless of the logic, and I shoved him back. "Fuck off, drunk." "My boy. There is a man that lives under the bridge. You must find him." Instead of shoving him a second time, I curled my fist and planted it firmly in his jaw with a satisfying thwack. He didn't respond, but his distress was evident, stuck on the ritual of scaring kids with inebriated outbursts. "Dad shit himself last night. I'm not mad. There's just something emotional about the fact that we've switched roles. I entered this world scantly, and now he is leaving it the same." He broke out his mementos and photos after I helped him in the bath, cooked him a man's breakfast which he ate 2 bites of, and let him rewake after noon. He's emotional, but stoically so. I can't argue with a dying man. He flipped through the pictures without much comment. Most of his dialogue came in the form of his posture relaxing or tightening. He was always a man of few words and of precise presence. Dad stopped at a photo of an old Jeep CJ equipped with 2 55-gallon drums, a pump, and a rubber hose. The community's first fire truck. "I drove it first," he smiled. "Never saved a house, but that pump moved more water than you'd credit." He laughed, and I'd have laughed with him, but instead I scowled at the bridge in the background of the photo. "Then it blew up with Johnny inside." He continued. "The brakes blew out in the heat, rolled away when he couldn't get out, and that flaming mess careened off the bridge into the creek. I don't think it made a difference for our Johnny." I was feeling as nostalgic as my ailing father, but couldn't identify the nagging memory. I was irritated by how little I could remember of my youth when I wanted to remember it, while he was flooded with history. "Who built the bridge?" I asked suddenly. "That old heap?" Dad scoffed. "Your grandpa did, but Grandma told me she remembered it as a kid. Ma never spent a day under 19 here. Pa came out here at 16 to dodge responsibility, faked a captain's license, and wooed your grandmother when he was down in Washington selling fish at Pike's after a wanton season of abundance. He says he built the bridge when she was pregnant with me, wanted to make sure we could get where we needed to when the ferry wasn't running. She was sure of it though, the bridge I mean." She spoke of it like she knew it so well. I argued. "She was sure of a lot of things, Nikki, just a defensive reaction to naive experience." Dad was tired, so I helped him back to bed and busied myself. I left for a walk to ease my mind, the stars blinking in the night like tired, glossy eyes, and soon the moon rose with them, illuminating the path before me. As I approached the bridge, I was curious more than dreadful to see the supposed man that lived under the bridge. It wasn't the kind of bridge to offer shelter. There wasn't anyone living under there. Ivan just babbled about some drug-fueled vision in his fleeting memory that he desperately clung to, I'm sure. I crossed the bridge, feeling the coldness of the water below rise up to meet me, and I walked down the bank some 30 feet to descend a gentler slope. Once level and beside the bridge, I stared into its black silhouetted maw. "Don't go through." Ivan interrupted me long before I could consider doing so. He crept up to join me before I noticed his presence. For a drunk, he was quiet-footed when he wanted to be. "You won't know where you'll come out," he continued. "Ivan," I sighed as I faced the man, uninterested in his bullshit. "It's a shitty bridge, not a portal to doomsday. You won't know when you'll come out." I thought briefly that he meant to say where, but he was specific with the enunciation of his words. I pinched the bridge of my nose in frustration. "Look through," and he gestured with his chin to the bridge behind me. As I turned to look, I could hear the crackle of intense heat and the smell of gasoline and soot. I was soon met with the visual of an old vehicle on the other side, engulfed in flames. I stepped back, accidentally submerging my foot in the water. Ignoring my discomfort, I ran up the bank, but as soon as I could look into the belly of the creek on the other side of the bridge, there was nothing. "What the fuck is this, Ivan?" I sneered. "Sometimes you go through and the gate closes. Gotta find another one instead, but they all meet there. There's a man that lives under." "Ivan, will you stop being such a cryptic lunatic and speak plainly for once? For fuck's sake?" Ivan laughed and scurried up the hill like the nasty goat he truly was, unwilling to provide further information. Dad died 2 days later, and we buried him 3 days after that. The morning after the flash of the burning car, the pungent, chemical odor wouldn't leave my nose, and Dad couldn't get out of bed that morning. It was downhill from there. At least it was quick, all told. The veil between life and death has felt thin in these most recent days. I don't think there's anything spiritual to it, but it's just relevant. Coincidentally, the orcas came into the harbor today, and the elders have always spoken that those blackfish only came to retrieve souls. They're 4 days late if that's true. I caught the local kids gossiping near the bridge, passing fleeting eyes to the minuscule legend. They were whispering something about long, gangly figures in flowing gowns emerging from under the bridge at night. It was likely just the evolution of the man that supposedly lived under there. My father wouldn't leave behind much of a legacy beyond my adoration for him, but of course Ivan's alcoholic delusions would stick far longer. Ironic, I guess. And speak of the devil, as I finish this journal, here he comes, Ivan. I can only imagine he's come to pay his twisted version of condolences. "There's a man that lives under the bridge," Ivan repeated for the umpteenth time. "Yes, but who is he?" I was exasperated. "Saika Blyet." Ivan always spoke in a Russian accent, but it was thickest when he cursed. He continued, "Don't you recognize your father? Image, story art, it's a man under a bridge."